Hi everyone, my name is Madeline Will and I'm a reporter who covers the teaching profession for Ed Week. We just got back from an hour and a half of conversations about professional development, so I'm looking forward to this conversation here. Let me introduce my colleagues. To my far left, I have Evie Blatt. She covers federal policy. And we have Sarah Schwartz, who covers curriculum, and Corey Mitchell, who covers teaching special populations of students. So teachers have a lot of frustration sometimes with professional development. There's a lot of blind spots, as we called it, a lot of missing pieces and areas that can be overlooked. So we all wrote about different issues that innovative solutions that districts are doing. So Sarah, I'd love to hear from you. You wrote about implicit bias training.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what that means.
Right. So implicit bias training is sort of based on the idea that everyone, not only teachers, are carrying with them a lot of unconscious biases as they go through their daily lives. And in a school setting, this can have a lot of consequences because teachers are often making a lot of decisions about discipline or are sort of the gatekeepers for who gets to pass on to those more advanced classes, AP, IB. And so if teachers have unconscious biases about students of color or about students from marginalized groups, that can really lead to a disparate educational opportunity. And so some school districts are trying to take this on and work on having teachers first name these biases and understand that they have them, and then work to sort of offset them. And so that's sort of what these trainings entail.
It sounds like that can be emotional conversations. How do you get people on board for those?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of our readers have sort of talked back to us about the concept of white fragility, which is that white people can often feel uncomfortable about having these conversations. They don't want to feel like they're doing something wrong. And so a lot of our readers have talked about sort of strategies for getting around that. And the broader context here is that the majority of the teaching profession is white. The majority of leadership in the teaching profession is white. And so it's, you need to get past this. And so there's some strategies that people have talked with us about. So the first one was a couple of school leaders have talked about how sharing their personal stories as white people who have come to recognize that this is a problem in themselves as well has helped their teachers sort of be willing to be more vulnerable. One school leader said that she brought in conversations with students as well who said, these things have happened to me in school in front of teachers, and they've made me feel uncomfortable, and then that has really made teachers sort of see the light there. I think that brings into other questions about, you need to make sure students feel comfortable doing that and that you're not asking them to do something that is too much of a burden for them. But that was one strategy that one school leader was using. There's also the question of when you make things mandatory and when you make things optional, and sort of how you bring people into that process. And so a lot of people were saying it makes sense sort of at the beginning to make it optional and try and build a group of sort of early adopters who are really ready to be vulnerable in that way. But then once those people have sort of established a culture, that you can then bring it out to the rest of the school and make it more mandatory. So those were some of the suggestions that people had.
And when you're talking about vulnerability,
yeah.
I mean, I would imagine if I were a teacher of color, I would feel some vulnerability in that situation as well.
Oh,
right?
totally.
It's something that you've personally experienced.
Yeah. So I think there's often an issue where teachers of color can sometimes be asked to speak as representatives or tokens, and that is something that a lot of our readers are trying really hard to avoid. I think that's definitely still an area of growth, though, because there's this tension of you don't want to put a teacher of color in that position. You also don't want to have have a white person in a leadership role in that conversation that then silences those voices.
Right.
So I think that's something that a lot of school districts are wrestling with how to do.
So interesting. Corey, and you wrote about how a lot of general education teachers are not prepared. They don't know necessarily some strategies for teaching students with disabilities and English language learners. So tell us, what do they need to know that they're not necessarily getting? Let's start with disabilities.
Well, just during the live chat, people were reaching out with more concerns than questions. They were saying, "Hey, we don't have many options. We don't know what to do." And in reporting the story that sort of preceded the summit, some of the educators offer some tips when you're working with special education teachers and general education teachers. They really want opportunities to co-plan and develop lessons together, and to really learn how to communicate both with teachers, but to also help both of those teachers communicate with parents to understand, because a child who has disabilities, that their parent may have not had that same experience in school. So you need to know how to communicate on a very basic level how these students are progressing, what type of support they need. Teachers also probably need more training on IEPs. Sort of this mysterious process for a lot of people, and helping general ed teachers and parents understand what's in the document and why it's important is another big thing. And finally, one really big thing, which Education Week has been reporting a lot about lately, is teaching reading to these groups. English learners and students with disabilities or who are in special education classes face challenges that some of their students don't. So really focusing in on those three areas when you're talking about students with disabilities. When you transfer and start talking about supporting English learners, a lot of folks, both in the chat and also in reporting the story, said that understanding the culture of your students is really key. And understanding how they engage with you and also how their families engage with you, and being able to work with the larger school community to connect not just with individual families but with the larger community as well, because there's not a lot of places that don't have English learners now. So you just have to be looking to connect with a larger community. So.
Yeah, it sounds like this is something that schools need to reckon with. Have you talked to districts that are really making a concentrated push in this area?
Yes, both in reporting for the special report that the summit was based on, but also elsewhere. When you talk about English learners, there are pockets of places around the country that are really pushing to get more Spanish-speaking students, teachers in classrooms. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult when you start talking about special education because there are shortages in that area as well. And just because of the difficult nature of the work, it's really tough to get people into those positions. They're hard to fill for tons of places around the country. So even before you start the discussion around PD is helping, get people in these positions in these classrooms to help and support these students. So,
So these are really important work, but I know, district leaders will say, well, there's only so many hours in a day. And Evie, you wrote about how there's a lot of PD requirements on teachers' plates and only so much time to do it. How do schools balance that?
Yeah, so a lot of these PD requirements have come down from state legislatures over time from a really sincere place of concern for child well-being. And what happens is oftentimes there will be a story in the news or an issue that really captivates leaders' concerns for children, and they'll respond to it by adding a training requirement for teachers. So a couple years ago, there was some unfortunate incidents with bullying that really dominated the news, and so training about responding to bullying came into the forefront, and some states adopted new policies related to that, which is obviously a very important thing. But some of the problem that comes into play is that sometimes these requirements build up over time and they may overlap some. Lawmakers may pass a requirement without really studying what's been on the books for 10 years. So you may see teachers being trained in identifying risk-taking behaviors in teens, but also being trained in drug prevention awareness when those two issues really overlap. Some teachers also say that things like implicit bias, whole child issues, social emotional learning, mindfulness, a lot of those things kind of mesh together. And when they are seen as these isolated, segmented requirements, sometimes it can feel like they're rushing through in compliance mode instead of feeling like they're having a meaningful conversation about how to put these things into place. And so some states are, at the urging of teachers, taking a look at that.
I think you said in your story that Connecticut counted it up, and there were 90 hours of required training, but most school districts only had 20 hours available.
Yeah. Yeah. And so some districts just weren't able to do it.
Yeah.
And some teachers I've talked to said, our district has some online modules and we do the same module on, say, suicide prevention every year. And it was meaningful the first time, but now it's rote. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that this is an important subject is not lost on them, but the idea that this is meaningful training maybe is. And so what Connecticut did was they formed this task force with all sorts of groups that don't necessarily always partner together on things. Teachers unions, administrative groups, the State Board of Education. And they looked at their requirements and said, what are some that overlap that we can just eliminate altogether? Are there some of these that we can narrow the scope of who's required to take them? Updates on reading instruction, for example. Do all secondary teachers need to take this when some of them don't deal with some of those reading issues that are more concentrated in the early years? Can some of these not necessarily be annual? And can we give districts more control over how they customize and tweak and shape things? One thing they also tried to do is form a ongoing board so that anytime the legislature wanted to add a new PD requirement, they could get non-mandatory feedback from this group that said, we think this is great, or we think this is too much. Lawmakers didn't go for that part of their recommendations. But there's definitely a group of folks who are still really paying attention and actively, kind of watching those ongoing discussions.
So like I said, we were just in an hour and a half long conversation with our readers about some of these issues. So I'm curious if any of you heard anything that really stuck out to you in terms of a challenge that teachers are dealing with or an innovative solution.
Just sort of piggybacking on what Debbie said about and wrote about with all the demands for PD. A lot of the folks in my room were saying, hey, this PD for general ed teachers is sort of crowding out my PD time that I could be spent focusing on the needs of my students. There were several questions about working with students with ADD or other identified disabilities and saying, hey, there's not enough time for me to do that because I'm just doing this general ed stuff. So I definitely heard about that and directed them to your story. So.
Yeah, and I think that if I were a teacher in an on-demand field that has some additional emotional stressors, you've got children who've got these individual needs that you're really trying to meet. I would want my PD to feel like it was coming from a place of support. I'm giving you the tools I need instead of a place of compliance. And I think it's really easy. It's hard to probably walk the talk on that one. Because there is just so much to accomplish and so many things teachers just naturally have to juggle.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And we'll be right back with another conversation about professional development, including failing forward and making PD more like Disney World. So stay tuned for that.
Hi, we're back with our more of our conversation about our conversation with our readers on teacher professional development. So I'm Sarah Schwartz. I'm a reporter here, and this is Allison Klein. She is an assistant editor, and Madeline Well, who's also a reporter. And we're going to talk a little bit about their stories and also the conversation that they had with our readers today. So I want to ask Allison first, your story, some of the teachers and the leaders there were making PD more like Disney World. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that means?
Sure. So the woman who I profiled, Diane Smokorowski, who goes by Smoke, and I'm actually going to call her Smoke for the rest of this conversation because her last name is hard to say. Sorry, Diane, if you're watching. Used to work actually at Disney World when she was younger, and she's just this presence. She has a lot of energy. She has just a lot of everything that you think of when you think of Disney. Not to be cheesy about it, but she's very interested in bringing in all sorts of elements and keeping you kind of on your toes in her professional development session. So she has literally brought teachers to Disney World, I think more than once, to sort of see how the company brings in what she calls these elements of surprise and delight to try to keep each customer engaged. And she says that that's what you as a teacher should be doing in your classroom. Now, this is not a commercial for Disney because she does do this. She does bring teachers, to other types of places. She's brought them to a center for new Americans so that they can see how that those folks are working with English language learners. She's brought them to Dunkin' Donuts so that they can, interact with a local business. When I visited her district, we went and played pickleball in a pickleball place so they could try a new activity and see how it sort of feels to be a student learning. She's also had she's had teachers do improv. Stand on an improv stage and try that out so they can kind of see what it's like to, again, be kind of in an uncomfortable position. And also, part of teaching is like getting up in front of people and being entertaining. So she tries to, in her PD sessions, model these kinds of more engaging and interesting strategies so that teachers can bring that into their classrooms. And it may sound kind of even a little cheesy or a little very different from the sort of content embedded, more serious PD that we hear a lot about. But I mean, she's gotten great feedback from the teachers in her district. They seem to really enjoy these sessions, and I talked to a bunch of them when I was out there, and they really see them as kind of can't miss. So apparently something's working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in your conversations with readers, did they feel the need for that kind of surprise and delight also, or what were their reflections on the state of PD today?
So I think there is a lot of concern that PD sessions, and this is something that we probably hear all the time and that most of our readers would be familiar with, are kind of like one and done, and they're boring, and they're not necessarily, and teachers feel like they're kind of repetitive. Sometimes they might feel like they're useful, but they're not necessarily, the folks who are delivering this PD aren't necessarily modeling engaging teaching, which is something that Diane tries to do in her district, which is just outside Wichita, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that definitely sounds different than what a lot of other teachers have told us about.
No, I'm not trying to make it sound like she's just bringing people on field trips. So she does, most of what she does is obviously in the classroom. So, and she's actually the technology, like a lot of what she does is helping to integrate new forms of technology into people's teaching. So, in doing this, she'll model a lot of different kinds of new tech, like Flipgrid or an app that, like, she had in the day that I came with her, and actually this is another field trip, but you could do this in your own school too. She had her teachers try out an app that's sort of a scavenger hunt type app. So when she does these sort of in classroom sessions, she still tries to keep up this sort of surprise and delight, engaging, more engaging kind of PD. So she brought in she'll bring in folks through Skype. To sort of model this idea of kind of global connection. She'll bring in people from Skype from all across the country, even all across the world, to sit on to chat with her teachers in PD. And then she also did just things that are just kind of wild. Like she had a what she calls a glow day, where she had all of the teachers write in like neon magic marker and under a black light, so that it kind of glowed. And then one of the teachers in that session, a math teacher, used that in her practice, and her high schoolers really thought that was kind of cool retro 80s thing to do. So you know, it's just she really tries to make sure that she's modeling engaging teaching.
Yeah. And that idea of being engaged and really being able to think on your feet is also a theme that was in your story, Maddie.
Yeah.
So I know that your story was about being able to bounce back from failure, and a big idea there is the idea of failing forward. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so, you know, teachers, like every professional, will make mistakes occasionally, but when you're teaching, it can be really scary, and like you can feel very vulnerable if you're making a mistake in front of, you know, a class of students. So experts say and educators say that they want more professional development and incorporate the idea of failing forward, which is the idea that you can take a mistake and use it as an opportunity to grow, and you can get better, and you can use it as an opportunity for reflection and just be a better teacher because of it.
I imagine that is, a challenging skill to develop. How can leaders, school leaders, district leaders, make it an environment where teachers can feel, comfortable being vulnerable enough to learn that skill?
Yeah, it absolutely has to start from the top. If a teacher is willing to, admit their mistakes and talk about it openly with other educators in the school, they have to not be afraid that they're going to get punished for trying something risky in the classroom and not having it work out perfectly. So the school leaders need to create this culture of openness and risk-taking and encourage that. And that can come through just letting people know explicitly, like, it's okay to take a risk. And if you take a risk and it doesn't work out, tell us about it, and we'll bring a coach in and help you revise your game plan and do it better the next day.
Are there any examples of that, either from your story or from talking with some of our readers earlier today, that really stick out to you?
Well, I think just the idea of one teacher was telling me that she encourages teachers to seek reflection from their students too, which I think is so important, just to be vulnerable and go to your students and say, hey, like, how am I doing? And to have them share their reflections with you, and then bring it back to the larger professional development with your coach and go over those responses and take it into account.
Was there anything else from talking with our readers today in the chat that really stood out to you, or that you wanted to bring as a takeaway to our readers who are tuning in here?
Yeah, I think that teachers feel like sometimes that there's a lot of pressure, a lot of accountability placed on them, and that they were saying, it can be scary with those pressures to be vulnerable, to share their classroom data that might not be where they want it to be. So having that climate and building that climate of it's okay to make mistakes, we're in this together, really works out great. I talked to a person for my story who writes the books, How to Teach Like a Pirate, Dave Burgess, and he was saying, be like a pirate. Don't be afraid of failing, and don't be afraid of mediocrity, because you can just keep fighting and it'll work out. And I think that's kind of a empowering lesson that teachers can hear, and important to keep in mind.
Allison, so earlier in our previous conversation, Evie was talking a little bit about how there are lots of different state or district mandated PD requirements, and I was wondering if those requirements ever got in the way of this more sort of surprise and delight focused PD that was really focusing on engagement. Were there ever competing priorities there?
So that's a great question. I think you can use, I think what Diane would say, and she's not here, but in my best channeling of her, I think what she would say is that you can use these kind of more engaging techniques, which I think she did, in teaching, sort of a standards-based or, teaching whatever kind of content delivery the district or the state is looking for. So and this is actually a very popular strategy, over one summer, she and her district did this thing that they called I think they either called it Ed Camp or Science Camp or Tech Camp. But basically, they've started a summer camp, like at in the professional development, and they had T-shirts, and they had marshmallows and s'mores, and they sang songs, I believe, and they even had campfires, and they sat around the campfires. And the campfires were made out of paper, I should say. And important safety note, yeah. And they discussed, STEM. So it's not like you have to necessarily be moving away from this kind of content embedded PD to try this other kind of PD. It's sort of a both and, I think, for the Andover School District.
And the same question for you that I had for Maddie, is there anything that you really took away from your conversation with readers that you'd want to share out?
Well, I got the sense that people are just really frustrated with professional development, which is, again, is not something that is new, or but there was more engagement in the chatter that I had with readers than I've seen on sort of similar topics, and I just thought, there were so many questions about how to make technology accessible to teachers, how to make sure that teachers show up for PD, and that they don't feel like it's just like one more thing to check off the box, how to really make it can't miss. So it's something that definitely the people who are providing professional development are trying to think about. I don't know if teachers would think that I don't know if all teachers would say that they're successful at changing it and making it more engaging, but certainly it's something that was on the minds of a lot of readers today.
Did anyone in response have any suggestions for making it can't miss that would sort of connect to the strategies of those surprise and delight strategies?
Sure. Well, the Ed Camp strategy was really popular.
Yeah.
It's not something that, that's certainly not something that Andover says that it came up with itself. That's something that a number of districts have tried, and a number of the folks who were in the chat today say that they have tried it, and I think they find it to be pretty successful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did Maddie, in your room, did you hear any stories of how someone had failed forward that were especially inspiring to you?
No, we didn't really get into the concrete examples,
Yeah.
but I think I think that a coach told me that for this professional development to be successful, the coaches and the trainers need to be willing to be vulnerable with the teachers who they're training. So a coach will say that she'll start off the session by sharing her mistakes and admitting a time that something went wrong for her, and then teachers might feel more comfortable to open up as well, which I think is important to keep in mind.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us in this conversation. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who joined our conversation today in the chat, and for watching this live stream.